By the third time Ukrainian drones had come for the Sverdlov plant, the people responsible for defending it believed they finally understood the problem. New point defense positions had gone up around the industrial zone. Electronic warfare units had been added along the approach corridors. Officials in Nizhny Novgorod Oblast had spent months telling residents that Dzerzhinsk was better protected than it had ever been. None of that changed. What a small formation of drones already inbound on the night of August 19 was about to prove for a fourth time that a facility built to manufacture explosions is a difficult thing to fully insulate from, becoming one itself. The Sverdlov plant is not a symbolic target. It is over a century old, one of the largest explosives producers in Russia, and a direct input supplier to the country's war effort rather than a downstream consumer of it. Specific workshops inside the complex produce hexogen and octogen, two high-explosive compounds used as the working charge inside artillery shells and precision-guided aerial bombs. Every Russian battery firing on Ukrainian positions along the front, every guided bomb dropped on a Ukrainian city, ultimately traces back through a supply chain that, at some point, ran through a facility like this one. Ukraine's own government had placed Sverdlov under sanctions specifically for that reason. And the United States, the United Kingdom, the European Union, Japan, and Switzerland had each done the same. A target does not accumulate that particular list of sanctioning governments by accident. This was also not the first time Ukraine had decided the plant needed to burn. In October 2024, drones tied to Ukraine's Military Intelligence Directorate and Security Service struck the complex directly, damaging the hexogen and octogen production workshop itself, the closest thing the facility had to a beating heart. 5 months later, a follow-up strike hit a pipeline trestle carrying material between production buildings and damaged 2 further workshops. By April 2026, drones were back again, this time triggering a fire large enough that residents miles away filmed the smoke rising over the city before Russian officials said a word about it. Between each strike, satellite imagery and open-source analysts documented the same pattern: scorched roof sections patched over, a damaged workshop wall rebuilt. Production quietly resumed at reduced capacity, while officials described the facility, whenever asked, in the vaguest possible terms. None of those strikes had shut Sverdlov down permanently. Each one had simply made the next strike a little easier. Chipping at redundancy, the plant could no longer fully rebuild between attacks. August 19 was not a new campaign. It was the same campaign, returning to unfinished business. The formation that flew toward Dzerzhinsk that night had almost 900 kilometers of Russian territory to cross, more than twice the distance most short-range strike drones can manage, which meant the aircraft involved belonged to Ukraine's small family of long-range types built specifically for this kind of mission, propeller-driven, relatively slow by military standards, and cheap enough that losing several of them along the way was an acceptable cost of doing business. Flying that far without being intercepted depends less on speed than on staying beneath the altitude where ground radar can reliably hold a track, and on choosing a flight corridor that avoids the densest clusters of Russian air defense rather than trying to punch straight through them. Nizhny Novgorod Oblast sits far enough east of the primary defensive belt protecting Moscow that a drone threading the gap between coverage zones can, for long stretches, simply not appear on anyone's screen at all. That did not mean the flight was uncontested. Electronic warfare positions strung along the approaches to Russia's western industrial regions routinely attempt to jam the satellite navigation link that lets a drone confirm its exact position mid-flight, forcing the aircraft to fall back on inertial guidance and preloaded waypoints that do not depend on an external signal at all. A jammed drone does not necessarily crash or turn back. It simply stops trusting GPS and continues flying the route it was given before it ever launched, accepting a small, accumulating position error in exchange for continuing to exist. Russian air defense officials in the region would later describe their systems as having repelled the attack in the industrial zone around Dzerzhinsk. They did not specify what, exactly, had been repelled or explain the smoke that residents were already filming by the time that statement was made. Point defense of a single, small object is a solved problem. A pantsir or TOR system covering a missile silo or a radar array only has to protect a target with a footprint measured in tens of meters, and only has to watch a small number of approach angles. Sverdlov is not that kind of target. Its grounds sprawl across a fenced industrial zone large enough to contain dozens of separate production buildings, storage bunkers, pipeline runs, and administrative structures, spread over an area that a handful of short-range air defense systems simply cannot blanket with the same density they could apply to a compact military installation. Defending Sverdlov completely would mean defending, in effect, an entire small district, every rooftop a potential aim point, every gap between buildings a potential approach lane. A defender has to be right everywhere, all the time. A single drone, with even a rough idea of where the hexogen and octogen workshops sit, only has to be right once. A facility that had now been hit on its fourth documented occasion in under 2 years had, by this point, developed something close to a reputation, the industrial equivalent of a regular customer. Nobody at the front desk was happy to see walk back in. At least one drone in the formation struck near the residential edge of Dzerzhinsk rather than the plant itself, damaging a multi-story apartment building roughly 5 kilometers from the industrial zone. No casualties were reported from that impact. The greater damage and the greater strategic cost was several kilometers away, where open-source analysts tracing the smoke plume back to its source identified the grounds of the Sverdlov complex itself as the point of origin. Fires large enough to be visible across the city do not start on their own inside a facility whose primary product is designed to detonate on command. They start when something that was never supposed to ignite outside a controlled charge does so. Anyway, in a building full of material specifically engineered to burn violently and completely once it starts. Russian authorities offered the same pattern of response that had followed each of the 3 previous strikes. Confirmation that explosions and a fire had occurred somewhere in the vicinity, paired with no confirmation of what, specifically, had burned. Independent monitoring channels and open-source analysts filled in what officials would not, cross-referencing the direction of the smoke, the layout of the industrial zone, and the plant's known history as a repeat target to reach the same conclusion within hours. By morning, it was one of the least contested, unconfirmed facts of the war. The strike on Dzerzhinsk did not happen in isolation. The same overnight window saw Ukrainian drones reach targets in Ufa, Tula, and the outskirts of Moscow itself, part of a broader pattern of dispersed, simultaneous long-range strikes that has become the default shape of Ukraine's deep strike campaign rather than the exception. Russia's Ministry of Defense claimed its air defenses destroyed more than 450 drones across 21 regions that same night. Even if every part of that figure were accurate, it says nothing about the formation that reached Dzerzhinsk. A defense network does not need to fail everywhere to fail somewhere, and somewhere was, once again, enough. What makes Sverdlov different from a rocket factory or an airbase is that it was never going to be destroyed in a single night, by a single strike, or even by 4 of them. A facility built around chemical production lines, spread across a site that has grown for more than 100 years, does not have one building whose loss ends the story. It has dozens, most of them redundant with each other by design, precisely so that a single accident on the production floor does not halt the entire operation. That redundancy is also what makes the plant a legitimate long-term target, rather than a one-time trophy. Every workshop Ukraine damages is one fewer line, converting raw chemical stock into the explosive fill for a shell that will eventually be fired at a Ukrainian position. Nothing about the August 19 strike shut Sverdlov down for good, and nothing about it was expected to. The plant will likely rebuild what burned, resume at least partial production, and continue supplying a war effort that still needs what it makes. Ukraine's bet is simply that the next strike will find it a little less redundant than the last one did, and that a factory whose entire purpose is manufacturing the ability to explode will, sooner or later, run out of ways to avoid doing so on someone else's schedule. If you think the plant's location, 900 kilometers deep inside Russia, mattered more to this story than its history as a repeat target, or the other way around, say which one in the comments below. If you want more reconstructions like this one, breaking down exactly how a single strike unfolds, system by system, consider subscribing to the channel. Peace for Ukraine, and let us hope wars like this come to an end soon. Goodbye.